They said they were HOA cops. Badges boots the whole tough guy act on my front porch. Claimed they had the right to search my house. One small problem, we're not even in an HOA. And the best part, they had no clue who my wife really was. What happened next? I still think about it when I see her out there watering the petunias like nothing ever happened. I mean, what do you even do when fake authority shows up with real attitude? Would you have opened the door or grabbed your phone? Seriously, tell me in the comments what you would have done. Let me set the scene for you. It was a peaceful Tuesday afternoon in our little suburban paradise. You know the type where the biggest drama is, usually someone forgetting to bring their trash cans in on time. I'm Malcolm, by the way, 40 years old, high school civics teacher, and part-time security equipment repair guy. Pretty boring life, which is exactly how I like it. My wife Claire and I have been married for 5 years, and she's this incredibly gentle woman who spends her days gardening and reading mystery novels. She's 45, retired from some federal job she never talks much about, and honestly, the most peaceful person I've ever met. Every morning she goes for her 3-mile jog, comes back looking like she could run another 10 miles, but then spends the rest of the day puttering around in her flower beds or curled up with a book. So, there I am sitting at our kitchen table, grading civics test papers, ironic considering what was about to happen, when I hear this aggressive pounding on our front door. Not knocking. Pounding. Like someone was trying to break the thing down. Claire had just gotten back from her run and was still in her workout clothes, grabbing a glass of water from the fridge. We looked at each other with that "what the heck" expression married couples share when something weird happens. I got up to answer it, but Claire was closer, so she headed to the door first. I'm not even sure why I didn't insist on going myself. Maybe I was just too focused on those test papers, or maybe some part of me already sensed that Claire could handle whatever was out there better than I could. When she opened the door, there were 3 men standing on our porch, all wearing official-looking uniforms with badges that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The guy at the front looked like a security guard in a community theater production name tag, said Gary Attitude Scream Mall Cop with a badge complex. He immediately started barking orders like he was some kind of real cop. "Ma'am, we're HOA enforcement officers, and we need to conduct a mandatory violation inspection of your property. You can let us in voluntarily, or we can make this process very difficult for you." I swear the way he said it, you'd think he had federal authority or something. The 2 guys behind him just stood there, trying to look intimidating, which honestly would have worked on me. I'm a teacher, not a tough guy. But Claire. She just stood there calmly looking at these 3 wannabe warriors like they were mildly interesting insects. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake," Claire said in that polite but firm voice she uses when she's being patient with someone who's clearly confused. "Our house isn't part of any HOA. We have all the property documents if you'd like to see them." Now, any reasonable person would have said, "Oh, sorry for the confusion," and walked away. But Gary wasn't reasonable. He got more aggressive, stepping closer to our door and raising his voice. "Ma'am, we have legal authority in this neighborhood. You can cooperate voluntarily, or we can make this process very difficult for you." I'm standing there thinking, should I be filming this? Should I call someone? My wife looks so calm facing these 3 intimidating guys, but I can see they're getting more hostile by the second. Part of me wanted to step in, but something told me to let Claire handle it. Maybe it was the way she was standing, or maybe it was just that she seemed completely unruffled by their threats. That's when Gary made his biggest mistake. He actually stepped onto our property without permission, his 2 backup guys moving closer behind him. "Listen, lady, we're coming in whether you like it or not. We have reports of multiple violations, and we're authorized to conduct a full search." The way he said it with this smug little smirk, like he was enjoying intimidating what he thought was just some suburban housewife. Claire blinked, then stepped back, not in fear, but as if measuring their angle of entry. I watched her take 1 small step backward, and her entire posture changed. It was subtle, so subtle that Gary didn't even notice, but I saw it immediately. She went from looking like my gentle gardening wife to something else entirely, something that set off every alarm bell in my head, even though I couldn't explain why. Before Gary could finish his threat, Claire twisted his wrist at the joint and stepped aside. The second man doubled over with a knee to the gut. The third froze just long enough to get dropped by a sweep I'd only seen in action movies. One moment, 3 grown men were standing there acting tough and threatening my wife. The next moment, all 3 of them were on the ground groaning, and looking like they'd been hit by a truck. I literally blinked and missed whatever Claire did. Gary was clutching his wrist, one of his buddies was curled up, holding his stomach, and the third guy was just lying there, staring at the sky like he was trying to figure out how he'd ended up horizontal. Claire calmly pulled out her phone and dialed 911. 911, I need to report 3 individuals impersonating law enforcement officers and attempting to unlawfully enter a private residence. Her voice was completely steady, like she'd just finished watering the petunias instead of single-handedly taking down 3 men twice her size. I've been married to this woman for 5 years. I thought I knew everything about her favorite coffee, her reading habits, the way she hums while gardening. But watching her move like that, seeing those 3 guys neutralized before they even knew what hit them. For 5 years, I thought I'd married a mystery novelist who liked petunias. Turns out I married the reason half the mystery novels get written in the first place. And honestly, part of me was excited to find out what else I didn't know. But another part was starting to wonder if I really wanted to discover what Claire was truly capable of. The real police officers arrived within minutes, 2 of them both looking professional and competent in a way that made Gary's fake uniform look even more ridiculous. The 2 officers slowed as they took in the scene. One touched his belt, the other scanned Claire like he'd walked onto a movie set and wasn't sure who had top billing. 3 big guys down 1 small woman standing. The older officer, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes, approached Claire carefully. "Ma'am, can you tell us what happened here?" His tone was professional but cautious, like he was trying to figure out if my wife was the victim or the perpetrator. Meanwhile, Gary was doing his best to play the injured party despite being in obvious pain. "Officer, I was assaulted while performing official HOA duties." He waved his fake badge around, demanding that Claire be arrested for assault. The guy actually had the nerve to act like he was the victim here, even though he'd been the one making threats and trying to force his way into our house. This woman attacked us without provocation. We were just trying to do our jobs. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but honestly, I was too worried about what the cops might think. Looking back, I should have known Claire had everything under control, but at the time, I was genuinely concerned we might both end up in handcuffs. That's when something weird happened. The older officer studied Claire carefully, and I could see recognition flickering in his eyes. "Ma'am, excuse me for asking, but do you have any law enforcement background? Something about the way you handled this situation?" He trailed off, waiting for her response. Instead of answering directly, Claire reached into her purse and pulled out this old leather wallet I'd never seen before. She opened it and showed something inside to the officer, something I couldn't see from where I was standing. From my angle, I couldn't see what was inside, but the older cop straightened up like someone had just saluted him. But whatever it was, it changed everything immediately. The officer's entire demeanor shifted from suspicion to professional respect, almost like he was talking to a colleague instead of a civilian. "We'll handle this situation properly, ma'am. These gentlemen will be coming with us for questioning." Just like that, no more questions about what had happened, no doubt about who was in the right. The younger officer started helping Gary and his buddies to their feet, while the older one took Claire aside for a quiet conversation. I couldn't hear most of what they were saying, but I caught fragments. "Appreciate your restraint," and obvious they had no idea. Suddenly, the cops were treating my wife like she was one of them, and I'm standing there feeling completely lost. What was on that card? Why did everything change the moment he saw it? Claire just stood there like this was completely normal, like she dealt with fake law enforcement officers and police investigations every Tuesday afternoon. As they were loading Gary into the police car, he overheard part of the officer's conversation with his partner. I was close enough to catch it too. Former federal agent, FBI background. These idiots had no idea who they were messing with. Gary's face went completely white as the words sank in. You could actually see the moment it hit him, the realization that he'd just tried to intimidate a federal agent. "FBI? She's FBI? We just tried to intimidate a federal agent." His voice cracked like a teenager's, all that fake authority completely gone. The officer loading him into the car just shook his head. "Former FBI, but yeah, you gentlemen picked the wrong house to mess with today." I wish I could tell you I kept my cool at that moment, but honestly, my jaw was probably hanging open. FBI, my quiet gardening wife used to be FBI. After the police left with Gary and his wannabe enforcement team, I turned to Claire with about 1,000,000 questions bubbling up in my head. But before I could ask even one of them, our phone rang. Claire answered it, and I could tell immediately from her tone that this wasn't a normal call. "This is Deborah from the Willowbrook HOA," said a cold, calculated voice on the other end. I could hear her clearly because Claire had put it on speaker. "I heard about today's incident. Gary told me some very interesting things about your wife's background." There was something different in Deborah's voice, not just anger, but genuine concern, like she was testing the waters to see how much trouble she was really in. "What exactly did Gary tell you, Deborah?" Claire's response was direct and uncompromising. I could hear the steel underneath her calm tone, and apparently so could Deborah, because there was a long pause before she answered. "He mentioned something about federal connections. Former law enforcement, perhaps? That complicates things, for everyone involved." The way she said complicates made it clear she was worried about more than just community standards. Claire just listened without confirming or denying anything, which somehow made the silence even more intimidating. I'm not sure how she did it, but even over the phone you could feel the power dynamic shifting. "Well, federal agent or not, you're still subject to community standards," Deborah finally said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "We'll see how far your connections really reach." It was clearly meant to be a threat, but it came out sounding more like desperate bravado. After Claire hung up, Claire didn't say anything, just stared at the phone like it was a chessboard she'd already seen the end of. Then she looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Honey, I have a feeling tomorrow is going to be very interesting." Part of me was excited to see what Claire would do next, but another part of me was starting to wonder if I really wanted to find out what my wife was truly capable of. And for sure, I still wasn't sure if I should be proud or terrified. The next morning, there was a thick, official-looking envelope in our mailbox. Not delivered by the regular mail carrier, this thing was just sitting there when I went out to get the newspaper, like someone had hand-delivered it during the night. Inside was an HOA violation notice claiming our grass was non-compliant with community standards because the length was allegedly too long. I literally mowed 2 days ago with a ruler to check the height, because I teach civics and I understand the importance of following rules to the letter. But apparently, according to this notice, our lawn was somehow a threat to neighborhood property values. The whole thing was typed up on official letterhead with fancy borders and legal-sounding language that would have intimidated most people. Most people who weren't married to someone who apparently used to investigate this kind of thing for a living. Claire read the notice and actually laughed the first time I'd heard her genuinely amused since this whole mess started. "They're really going with the death by 1,000 paper cuts approach," she said, shaking her head with what I can only describe as professional appreciation for their tactics. Classic intimidation tactic. Make you feel like you're drowning in bureaucracy until you just give up and pay whatever they want. She even pointed out specific phrases in the notice that were designed to sound more official than they actually were. "See this part about municipal compliance standards? That's completely made up. There's no such thing at the county level for private residences." Watching her analyze their strategy like she was dissecting a case study was both fascinating and slightly unnerving. But her amusement didn't last long, because over the next 3 days, more violation notices arrived daily. Each one more ridiculous than the last. A parking violation for having our car in our own driveway. A window covering violation because our curtains were supposedly the inappropriate color for neighborhood aesthetics. And my personal favorite, a garden violation claiming that Claire's flower varieties weren't approved by community standards. After that came the avalanche paper snowballs accusing us of infractions so absurd, they read like HOA satire, improper mailbox spacing, unauthorized shades of beige, unharmonious holiday decor. I mean, seriously, they were going after her prize-winning roses now. The woman spends hours every weekend nurturing those plants, and suddenly they're a community standards violation. I was getting angrier with each ridiculous notice, but Claire's reaction was evolving in a completely different direction. By the 4th notice, Claire wasn't laughing anymore. She went completely quiet, staring at the latest piece of paper for a full minute without speaking. I could see her processing something deeper than just the absurdity of fake violations. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she got this look in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more calculating. Each notice carried escalating fines, $50, $100, $200, $500, all with legal threats if payments weren't received within exactly 7 days. The letterhead looked professional, the language sounded official, and if you didn't know better, you'd think this was all completely legitimate. Looking back, I realized that was exactly the point. They were using fake legal authority to pressure people into compliance, and it probably worked on most of their targets. I pulled up the HOA charter scan for bylaws and found nothing, not a single clause that applied to us. That's when I knew this wasn't enforcement. It was paperwork warfare. My voice was getting louder and more frustrated with each word. This is pure harassment, and they're using fake legal authority to do it. How is this even legal? Shouldn't there be some kind of oversight for this stuff? I was pacing around our kitchen at this point, practically shouting at the unfairness of it all. But Claire had gone into what I was starting to recognize as her professional mode. She quietly disappeared into her home office and started pulling out file folders I'd never seen before. She opened a file labeled County Archive 95, Auth Boundary Maps. Inside was a faded fax barely legible. She read it like scripture. "Malcolm, I need you to bring me every document we have about this neighborhood's history, deed, property records, everything," she called from the office. There was something in her tone that made me stop complaining and start following orders. It wasn't harsh or commanding, but it had the weight of absolute authority behind it. I spent the next hour digging through our filing cabinet, bringing her everything remotely related to our house purchase and property records. While I was gathering documents, I could hear her making phone calls in a voice I'd never heard before. Professional measured using terminology that sounded almost like a different language. What we discovered in those old county property records was exactly what Claire had suspected. Our neighborhood was never officially incorporated into any HOA boundaries. We were completely outside their jurisdiction, not by a little bit, but by several blocks. The original HOA charter from 1995 clearly showed their authority ending exactly 3 blocks away from our house. They had zero legal standing here, and according to the public records, they never had. But it got worse. She pulled up the county GIS records on her laptop. 2 versions of the neighborhood map loaded, one official one, submitted by HOA. The second included 5 extra blocks hours among them. Claire found evidence in the public HOA filings that they'd been systematically doing this to other families, expanding their control into areas where they had no legal authority whatsoever. Someone had actually modified the boundary maps in the official filings, clearly altering them to include additional streets and neighborhoods that weren't in the original charter. "They picked the wrong neighborhood to mess with," Claire said, looking up from the documents spread across our dining room table with steel in her eyes. "And they definitely chose the wrong house." The way she said it, with that quiet intensity I was starting to associate with her mysterious professional background, made me realize this was about to become much bigger than just our property. She was organizing the documents into neat stacks, creating what looked like evidence files, and I could see her mind working through something complex and methodical. Watching Claire spread those legal documents across our dining room table, seeing that focused intensity I'd never witnessed before, I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or absolutely terrified about what was coming next. But one thing was becoming crystal clear: my quiet gardening wife wasn't just some retired federal employee. She was someone who knew exactly how to fight back against this kind of systematic abuse, and she was getting ready to do exactly that. Claire announced that she was attending the next monthly HOA meeting, and the way she said it made it clear this wasn't a request for my opinion. It's time to settle this situation properly and publicly. I know my wife is incredibly capable. I'd seen evidence of that when she took down 3 grown men without breaking a sweat, but watching her prepare to walk into a room full of hostile people who clearly had it out for us, I realized I'd never actually seen Claire in what she called work mode before. She spent the entire morning organizing documents, making copies, and preparing what looked like a legal presentation. But it wasn't just the paperwork that caught my attention. It was watching her transform right before my eyes. The Claire who usually puttered around in gardening clothes and hummed while watering plants was gone. In her place stood someone I barely recognized. She dressed in a sharp business suit I didn't even know she owned, pulled her hair back in a severe bun, and carried herself with an authority that seemed to radiate from every step. She adjusted her collar in the mirror with surgical precision. The woman who used to plant lavender now sounded like she was prepping for cross-examination. She practiced her presentation in front of our bathroom mirror, and I could hear her voice change from my gentle wife's tone to something commanding and professional. "This is how you address a hostile crowd," she explained when she caught me watching. "You never let them see uncertainty, and you always control the room from the moment you walk in." Just before we left, I asked, "You sure this isn't overkill?" Claire replied, eyes locked forward. "Overkill is what they've been doing for weeks. I'm here to balance the scales." The community center was packed with about 40 residents when we arrived, the monthly HO. A meeting was apparently a big social event in this neighborhood, though I got the feeling most people came for the drama rather than any genuine interest in community governance. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table at the front, and the buzz of conversation filled the room like we were attending some kind of sporting event. Deborah sat at the front table with her board members, all of them wearing matching blazers like some kind of uniform. The moment she spotted Claire entering, her face lit up with this smug, victorious smile that made my stomach turn. She was clearly expecting to humiliate us in front of the entire community, probably figured that public embarrassment would be enough to make us back down and pay whatever fines they wanted to impose. Deborah opened the meeting by discussing problematic residents who refuse to respect community standards and appropriate responses to non-compliance issues. She never mentioned our names directly, but she stared at Claire the entire time, making it crystal clear who she was talking about. "Some people seem to think they're above the established rules that make our community beautiful," she said with that fake smile plastered across her face, her voice dripping with condescension. "Fortunately, we have effective ways of dealing with that kind of attitude. Our enforcement procedures are thorough, legal, and designed to maintain the property values that we all work so hard to protect." Someone in the back whispered, "This is getting weird." Another neighbor shifted in their seat, like they just realized they might be next. The thinly veiled threats were obvious to everyone in the room, and I could see some of the other residents shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I'm not sure if they were uncomfortable with Deborah's tactics or just worried about becoming targets themselves, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Claire sat quietly through the entire agenda, taking notes in a small notebook I'd never seen before. She waited patiently for the public comment period, never interrupting, never showing any reaction to Deborah's provocations. It was like watching a master chess player wait for their opponent to make all their moves before revealing their strategy. When Deborah finally called for questions from the community, Claire stood up with the kind of confidence I'd only seen in courtroom dramas. The entire room fell silent. You could literally hear people holding their breath. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When she placed the original property map on the table, it hit like a gavel. That's when she produced the original county property records, copies of the unaltered boundary maps and documentation, proving the HOA's illegal expansion attempts. She didn't make any dramatic gestures, just calmly laid out the evidence like she was presenting a case in court, which I realized later was probably exactly what she was doing. Those documents. Deborah's face transformed from confident smugness to genuine fear in a matter of seconds. Her voice cracked slightly as she tried to maintain composure. Her fingers twitched near her water bottle. She didn't reach for it. "Where did you even get those? How did you—" She couldn't finish the sentence, probably because she was starting to understand just how much trouble she was in. "Public records," Claire replied calmly, "available to any citizen who knows where to look and how to request them properly." The way she said it was almost educational, like she was teaching a civics lesson about government transparency. But there was steel underneath those words, and everyone in the room could hear it. Other residents started murmuring among themselves, several pulling out phones to record what was happening. The mood in the room was shifting dramatically, and you could see Deborah starting to panic. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly gentleman in the back row stood up and said, "They did this exact same thing to my family 2 years ago, said we had to join their HOA or face legal consequences." His voice was shaky but determined, like he'd been waiting years for someone to give him permission to speak up. Suddenly, other people were speaking up, sharing similar stories about Deborah's systematic expansion tactics. "They told us our fence was a violation," called out a middle-aged woman, "made us pay $300 for a permit we didn't need." It was like watching a dam break. Once one person found the courage to speak, everyone wanted to share their experiences. Deborah was losing control of her own meeting, and she knew it. Her face was getting redder by the minute, and I could see her hands trembling as she tried to maintain authority. In desperation, she ordered the community center security to remove Claire, claiming the meeting was exclusively for current HOA members only. But Claire was ready for that too. Actually, state law requires these meetings to remain open to all residents affected by HOA decisions. Would you like me to read the specific statute number? The way she said it, so calm and matter of fact, made it clear she wasn't bluffing. Deborah knew she was trapped, and her fake authority was crumbling in front of everyone. That's when Deborah completely lost it. She stormed out of her own meeting, but not before stopping at Claire's row and hissing, "You have absolutely no idea who you're dealing with, lady." Honestly, what would you do at this point? Keep pushing forward or back down before things escalate even further? I was genuinely curious to see how far this would go, but part of me was worried we were poking a bear that might have more fight left than we realized. Watching Deborah's face as she stormed out, seeing that mixture of rage and desperation, I knew this was nowhere near over, and I wasn't sure we were ready for whatever she'd try next. But looking at Claire, seeing that calm confidence as she continued answering questions from other residents, I was starting to realize that maybe we were more ready than I thought. 1 week later, I got a call that changed everything. I was sitting in the teacher's lounge during my lunch break, grading papers and trying to forget about HOA drama for a few minutes, when my principal called me into his office. The walk down that hallway felt like it took forever. You know that feeling, when you're called to the principal's office even as an adult. My stomach was doing flips and I couldn't figure out what I might have done wrong. "Malcolm, we've received multiple formal complaints about your teaching methods. You're suspended pending a full investigation." I literally stared at him for 10 seconds trying to process what he'd just said. My mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and I'm pretty sure I looked completely stunned. 5 years of teaching, never a single complaint about anything, and suddenly 3 different parents were claiming I was promoting dangerous anti-authority attitudes in the classroom. The timing was so obvious it was almost insulting. Did they really think I wouldn't connect the dots? I sat there in his office looking at the formal complaint spread across his desk, and I could feel my blood pressure rising with each ridiculous accusation I read. One claimed I was encouraging disrespect for community leaders. Another accused me of teaching legal disobedience. The language sounded copy-pasted like someone wrote a playbook and let them fill in the blanks. The principal, Mr. Henderson, looked almost embarrassed as he explained the situation. "I'm sorry, Malcolm, but we have to take these complaints seriously. The parents are threatening to go to the school board if we don't investigate immediately." I could tell he didn't believe the accusations either, but his hands were tied by district policy. All 3 complaining parents lived directly within Deborah's HOA boundaries. Their complaints used almost identical language and were filed on the same day, and I mean identical like they'd all copied from the same template. I teach civics, of course. I encourage students to understand their constitutional rights and question authority when appropriate. That's literally the point of the class. But apparently, teaching kids about the Bill of Rights was now considered dangerous anti-authority propaganda. I wasn't sure if I should laugh or scream, but sitting in that office facing suspension for doing my job correctly, laughing was definitely off the table. When I got home and told Claire what had happened, she sat completely motionless for 10 solid minutes, gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't speak a single word, just stared out the kitchen window like she was processing something much bigger than my job situation. I'd never seen her so still. It was almost scary. Her breathing was controlled and deliberate, and I could see her jaw muscles working like she was grinding her teeth. I wanted to call everyone to rant and scream and fight back immediately. I was pacing around our kitchen waving my hands and probably talking too fast, but Claire remained perfectly motionless throughout my entire tirade. Watching Claire process this attack, it was like watching a dangerous storm system building on the horizon. You could feel the electricity in the air, but you couldn't predict exactly when or where the lightning would strike. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was deadly calm. "They made this personal, Malcolm. That was their biggest mistake." The way she said it sent chills down my spine. Not because I was afraid of her, but because I was suddenly afraid for anyone who had just made themselves her enemy. Claire went wordless. She walked past me, pulled the door shut, and the air changed. I didn't see her again for hours, just heard the clatter of keys and clipped professional phrases. I stood in the hallway, watching her through a crack in the door. I wanted to help, say something. But this wasn't my war anymore. It was hers. And she was already deploying. I could hear constant phone calls in a voice I'd never heard before. Professional, authoritative, using terminology I didn't recognize. Fragments of conversation drifted through the closed door. Federal oversight questions, jurisdictional authority issues, pattern of civil rights harassment, need comprehensive documentation review. It was like listening to someone speak a foreign language, except I recognized all the individual words. I just had no idea what they meant when put together like that. Every so often I'd hear her pause to take notes, and the scratching of her pen on paper sounded unusually urgent. Eventually, Claire called me into the office and showed me an official federal complaint she'd prepared not just against the HOA, but specifically targeting Deborah for harassment and abuse of authority. The document was incredibly detailed, with dates, times, witness statements, and legal precedents I'd never heard of. It looked like something a team of lawyers might produce after months of work, but she'd put it together in a single afternoon. Her complaint read like an indictment. Not just facts and dates, but patterns charts, even victim statements from neighbors we hadn't spoken to in years. Somehow she already had their names. This isn't just about our family anymore, Malcolm. I've found evidence of 6 other families they have targeted using identical tactics. This is systematic civil rights harassment, and there are federal agencies that take this kind of abuse very seriously. She showed me a chart she'd created mapping out all the harassment cases with dates and patterns that made it clear this was organized and deliberate. Looking at that complaint, seeing how methodically she'd built the case, it hit me that she wasn't just fighting back randomly. She was approaching this like it was what she used to do professionally. Claire made one more phone call that evening, and this one I heard clearly because she didn't bother closing the office door. "It's Claire. Remember that HOA corruption case we discussed about 5 years ago? Well, I just found another one, and this time they made it personal." The person on the other end must have said something encouraging, because Claire smiled for the first time in days, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile a predator gives right before striking. No, they have no idea what they've gotten themselves into, but they're about to find out. I'll have the full documentation package to you by tomorrow morning. Would you trust your spouse to handle something this serious, or would you want to take control of the situation yourself? I've always been the type to want to fix things myself. But watching Claire work with that kind of precision and authority, I realized I was completely out of my league here. This wasn't the woman who watered roses anymore. This was someone built to pull weeds out by the root, and she was just getting started. Something in the tone of that final phone call told me that Claire wasn't just my quiet suburban wife anymore. She had become someone else entirely, someone I'd never actually met before. And I was starting to think that might be exactly what we needed. 1 week later, unmarked government vehicles started appearing throughout our neighborhood. No sirens, just sedans with government plates and agents in suits blending into the neighborhood. The whole thing was so subtle that most neighbors probably didn't even realize they were talking to federal investigators. But I recognized the signs because Claire had been preparing me for exactly this kind of response. She'd mentioned that when federal agencies get involved, they don't announce themselves with sirens and flashing lights. They work quietly and methodically, gathering evidence before anyone realizes they're under investigation. What I hadn't expected was how quickly everything would escalate once her federal contacts got involved. Deborah was still living in some kind of a fantasy world where she thought she could intimidate even a federal agent. She actually told neighbors that Claire was just a retired desk worker and that federal employment doesn't make you untouchable. I heard her at the grocery store confidently explaining to anyone who would listen that she'd dealt with difficult residents before, and that one former government employee doesn't scare me. The arrogance was almost breathtaking. Here was someone who had just poked a bear, and she was acting like she'd swatted a fly. Meanwhile, Gary was out on bail and getting increasingly paranoid. At the store, Gary kept glancing over his shoulder, like agents might crawl out of the cereal aisle. "You don't understand," he kept telling anyone who would listen, his voice getting higher and more frantic with each word. "She took down 3 of us like it was nothing, and the cops treated her like royalty. There's something different about her." But Deborah dismissed his concerns with typical arrogance. "Gary, you're being dramatic. So she has some government pension. That doesn't change anything. We have legitimate authority here, and no retired federal employee is going to intimidate me into backing down." The way she said it with such absolute confidence made it clear she had no idea what kind of professional network she was about to face. Gary tried to warn her, but Deborah was too invested in her own authority to listen to reason. "I've been running this HOA for 8 years, she told him during a conversation I overheard at the post office. "I know how to handle troublemakers, and I'm not backing down just because someone claims to have government connections." The disconnect between her confidence and the reality of the situation would have been funny if it wasn't about to destroy her life. The truth about Claire's background finally came out during a quiet dinner conversation about a week into the federal investigation. I'd been working up the courage to ask her directly about what the police officer had said, and she must have sensed my curiosity because she just casually mentioned, "I should probably tell you what I actually did for the FBI. I specialized in investigating exactly these types of cases. HOA fraud, fake legal authority, financial abuse of community residents." I literally stopped chewing and stared at her. The piece of chicken in my mouth suddenly felt like cardboard, and I had to force myself to swallow. "Wait, so when you said you used to investigate this stuff, you meant specifically HOA corruption. This is literally your area of expertise." She nodded, like it was the most natural thing in the world. 22 years with the Bureau, Civil Rights Division Community Fraud Unit. I've taken down dozens of operations exactly like Deborah's. I retired 3 years before we met because I thought I was done with this world. She continued cutting her chicken like we were discussing the weather, instead of her secret career fighting organized fraud. But apparently this world isn't done with me. The casual way she said it made me realize that what we'd been dealing with wasn't just random neighborhood drama. This was a federal case involving systematic fraud, and my wife wasn't just some victim fighting back. She was a professional who'd spent 2 decades specializing in exactly this type of crime. She'd taken down HOA rings worth millions fraud cloaked as governance intimidation disguised as order. Deborah had no idea she wasn't just fighting a former federal agent. She was fighting someone who literally wrote the book on prosecuting HOA fraud. That's when Gary finally understood the magnitude of their mistake. He called Deborah in an absolute panic. "Deborah, I looked her up online. She's not just former FBI, she's the agent who took down the Riverside HOA fraud ring 5 years ago. They got 15 years in federal prison." For the first time since this whole thing started, I heard genuine fear in Deborah's voice when Gary played me the recording of their conversation later. What exactly are we dealing with here?" she asked, and you could hear her world collapsing in real time. "We messed with someone who literally wrote the book on prosecuting HOA fraud," Gary replied, his voice cracking with terror. "We're in serious trouble, like federal prison serious trouble." The conversation went on for another 10 minutes, with Gary desperately trying to convince Deborah to back down, and Deborah still clinging to the fantasy that her fake authority would somehow protect her. Claire revealed that the federal investigators had found systematic fraud throughout Deborah's operation. Fake legal notices, unauthorized fee collection money from collected fines going directly into personal bank accounts instead of legitimate HOA expenses. The scope of the investigation had expanded beyond just our case to include several other neighborhoods where Deborah had been running similar scams. "She's been doing this for 8 years, Claire explained, showing me a federal evidence chart that looked like something from a crime drama. The fraud totaled over 200,000, and it was still rising. As word spread through the community, Deborah started making increasingly desperate moves, attempting to destroy documents and claiming everything was completely legitimate HOA business. But it was too late. Claire's federal contacts already had copies of everything: altered boundary maps, fraudulent violation notices, financial records showing personal use of collected money. Other residents who had paid fraudulent fines started coming forward demanding refunds and threatening their own federal lawsuits. Several families discovered they'd paid thousands of dollars in completely illegitimate fees over the years, thinking they had no choice but to comply with official-looking notices. Mrs. Patterson from 2 streets over had paid $1,200 in fake fines over 3 years. The Johnson family had been terrorized into paying for landscaping violations that weren't even real HOA standards. Watching Claire patiently explain legal procedures to our confused neighbors, seeing her help them understand their constitutional rights, I finally understood why she'd been so good at her previous career. She wasn't just fighting for us anymore. She was protecting an entire community from systematic abuse. The final coordination call came that evening. "We have everything we need. Arrests are scheduled for tomorrow morning." Claire's response was simple. "Good. It's time this situation ended properly and legally." I went to bed that night, realizing I had no idea who I'd actually married, and wondering whether I was emotionally prepared to see how this incredible story would really end. Thursday morning at 6 a.m., federal agents and local police arrived simultaneously at Deborah's house and the HOA office building. It was a coordinated law enforcement operation, the kind you see in movies, except this was happening right in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I watched from our front window as unmarked cars surrounded the HOA office 3 blocks away, and I have to admit there was something deeply satisfying about seeing all that fake authority crumble under the weight of real law enforcement. The agents moved with military precision, some taking positions around the buildings, while others approached with search warrants and arrest warrants. Gary was arrested at his apartment, and according to the police report I read later, he was found trying to flush documents down his toilet when the agents knocked on his door. The image of this tough guy, wannabe, desperately trying to destroy evidence while federal agents waited outside his bathroom door was almost too perfect. That's when he finally understood they were serious about this whole federal investigation thing. When the agents identified Claire as their consulting expert on the case, Deborah's face went through about 5 different emotions in rapid succession: shock, denial, rage, terror, and finally a kind of defeated acceptance. It was like watching someone's entire worldview collapse in slow motion. You were FBI this whole time. The harassment, the violations, everything. You were building a case. Her voice cracked on the word case, and I could see her hands shaking as the reality of her situation finally sank in. Claire's response was perfectly professional. I gave you a chance to stop. You chose escalation. This is the consequence. The way she said it, calm and factual, somehow made it even more devastating than if she'd been angry. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just the cold delivery of consequences for poor decisions. Gary, standing there in handcuffs, looked at Deborah with this expression of complete disbelief. His face was pale and sweaty, and he kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe how spectacularly everything had gone wrong. Told you she was different. We should have backed off. His voice was barely above a whisper, filled with the kind of regret that comes with understanding you've made a life-altering mistake. But Deborah was still processing the reality of her situation. But you're just a neighbor. You grow flowers. How are we supposed to know you were some kind of federal agent? The desperation in her voice was almost pitiful. She kept looking around like she expected someone to tell her this was all some kind of mistake, that her fake authority would somehow protect her from real consequences. Claire's final statement to them was something I'll never forget. That's exactly the point. You assumed you could intimidate anyone you wanted because you thought you had authority. That assumption just cost you everything. The words hung in the air like a judge's sentence, and I could see both Gary and Deborah finally understanding that their little power trip was over forever. What struck me most was how Claire delivered it, not with anger or vindication, but with the kind of professional detachment that made it clear this was just another case to her. They had become a cautionary tale about what happens when people abuse power they never actually had. The same day as the arrests, my school principal called with a complete reversal. All investigations were dropped. Full public apology, issued immediate reinstatement with back pay. Apparently, when the FBI investigates your accusers, people stop taking their complaints seriously, he said, sounding embarrassed about the whole situation. He actually offered me a commendation for standing up for constitutional education in the face of community pressure, which felt like overkill but was nice to hear. The remaining board members called an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to dissolve the current leadership structure entirely and start over with completely new people. Mrs. Chen from down the street even approached Claire about helping to rebuild the organization. We desperately need honest people to help lead this community, people who actually understand the law and respect residents' rights. But Claire declined the leadership role, which honestly didn't surprise me. I really appreciate that, but I think you need leaders from within your own community. I'm happy to provide legal advice when needed, but this should be your neighborhood run by you. Instead, a completely new HOA was formed, with actual legal boundaries, transparent financial practices, and genuine focus on community service, rather than control and power. In months, the HOA turned from a threat into a bridge connecting neighbors instead of policing them. All residents who'd paid fraudulent fines received full refunds from the seized HOA bank accounts. Some families recovered thousands of dollars they'd paid over the years, thinking they had no choice. The Johnson family got back over $2,000, and Mrs. Patterson was able to pay off some medical bills with her refund. 6 months later, our neighborhood looks completely different. The new HOA actually serves the community by organizing block parties, maintaining common areas, and facilitating positive neighborly connections. Claire replanted the flower bed that had received the very first violation notice, telling me with a smile, "This time I'm planting exactly whatever I want, because it's our yard on our property and we never belong to their HOA anyway." She chose the most gloriously non-compliant flowers she could find, wildflowers that grow in natural, unmanicured patterns that would have given Deborah nightmares. The story made local and national news as federal investigation exposes suburban HOA fraud ring, and other communities across the country reached out with similar concerns about HOA overreach in their areas. Claire ended up consulting on several other cases, helping other neighborhoods deal with similar problems. Deborah was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, plus $150,000 in restitution payments. Gary received 18 months incarceration and 500 hours of community service. The fraudulent HOA was officially disbanded by court order, and their fake enforcement authority was permanently revoked. What began as a corrupt power grab became a model for how neighborhoods can actually work together for everyone's genuine benefit. I realized I didn't just marry a sweet woman who likes gardening and mystery novels. I married someone who spent her entire career protecting ordinary people from exactly this type of systematic abuse. And honestly, that made me love her even more. The real lesson: you don't need to marry an FBI agent. You need to know your rights and use them. But when you know your legal rights and you're willing to stand up for them properly, you'd be amazed what ordinary people can accomplish. Claire is back to her peaceful gardening and mystery novels, but now neighbors regularly stop by seeking legal advice, and she's always happy to help. Sometimes the people who seem the most ordinary and quiet are actually the most extraordinary, and sometimes it takes encountering a real bully to help you discover what you're truly made of. The most important thing I learned: never assume you know everything about the people closest to you. They might just surprise you when it matters most. And if you stuck around this far, I'd really like to know, what would you have done if a bunch of fake enforcers showed up on your porch? Ever had someone pull rank on you with zero authority? Drop your story in the comments. I read all of them. And hey, if this one hit home or just made you smile a little, you can hit that like button or the little thanks icon below. It goes a long way to keeping these stories going. Thanks for hanging out with me through all of it. Take care of your peace and catch you in the next one.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your way.